In this video tutorial, we're going to talk about how to create a turntable of your character model. So I have my character here, and this isn't textured, but and again, I'm just kind of showing the animation side of the technique. And so you can see when I press W, the anchor point's all the way down there. And so one trick you can do to change the anchor point, I can always press D as in dog and move this up into the space right there. You can also, if you look for this button, that's center pivot, and so that'll center the pivot and right into the middle of wherever your model is. And I can press F to frame that back up. Yeah, so one other thing too is when I'm changing anchor points and stuff like that, I can tap spacebar to get to the orthographic view, and then type D as in dog, and I can move it down this way as well. And I can even, you can even hold V to snap it if you want to, but I'm just gonna do it like that. And so now I have the pivot in the center of my character, which I think is gonna be really important, because basically what we're gonna do is we're gonna rotate this, right? And if the pivot's not in the middle, if the pivot is out here, when I rotate, it's gonna, rotate wrong, right? So just this button right here, that'll center the pivot, and you should be good to go at that point. And so in a different tutorial, I'll talk about lighting and presentation, but I'm just keeping this solely focused on the animation. You're gonna wanna either, consider having some type of base to put the character onto, or you could create a cyc where you create like a curved background behind the character to have even lighting. And so I'll just create a cyc real quick. So I have this button which will create a plane, and if I press F, you can see that it creates a plane like that with 10 by 10. If I go to the attribute editor and then go under the third tab, which is polyplane, I just want the subdivisions to be really low, like how about 3 and 3, and that'll have us set up, and I'll scale this up a bit. And from here, I can, when I'm creating a cyc, I basically create a plane, right click and go to edge mode and select those edges. I'm going to turn symmetry off. I do not need symmetry right now. So I'll just select 3 edges, and then I will extrude and just do the blue arrow up this way. I'll add 3 divisions so that it looks something like this. And that's all you need to create a cyc, because we're creating a smooth background, but if I press 3, it smooths it out for me right there. I can always scale this up. And so now when I render, you can see there's not a hard edge that's distracting in the background right there. So, you could even combine them, right? You could put your character on a base. So I could create a base right here. And similarly, I'll kind of change the subdivisions on this. So I'll bring that up to 50. So I created a cylinder, added 50 for the subdivision axis to give that some subdivisions there. I can scale it up like this. And so the reason I did that is so there wouldn't be faceting on the edges. There'd be enough geometry. And whenever I'm lining up a base, just always go to the orthographic view. So you can type right here, or you can just tap spacebar, right? And I'll just have this, move it so that it just goes right on top of the cyc. And always be sure to name things right here. I misspelled that, but I'm going to keep moving here. So I have the cyc, and you see how I'm just using the orthographic view to line them up, and I like to have just a little bit of space between those 2 things. And so I'll do the same thing for the head. I'll just move that down. I kind of want this head to be floating a little bit. Ideally, your character would, have something a little more solid underneath. Also, ideally they'd have eyes and ears and texture, right? But so I'm just going to load the character up, and again, you see I'm using the orthographic view just to line them up. So now, if I were to light this, and again, lighting is going to be in a different tutorial, but if I were to light this, Arnold render, you can see I have a base that has like a little bit of difference on the ground. And then you see how that cyc is creating this nice smooth transition from wall to floor. So that can be really helpful in your process. And so from here, I just need to add some lights to this, and I'm, good to go. Okay, so Step one is just kind of set up, right? And so step two, let's see here. I need to create a camera. So I'm going to go to create camera and then camera. So create and camera. And you can see the camera's generated right down there. And so I'm just going to go to panels, perspective, and switch my perspective from the perspective view to the camera view. And from here, when you're moving the camera, you know, you always have the option. You could always go to like a split view or something like that and go panels, perspective, camera here, and then panels, perspective, perspective here. And so here you can see I can move the camera position. So you could do it that way, or you could just switch to the one view and just look through the camera. You see that? And line this up. And so when lining up the camera, I think one thing that's important is to turn on the resolution gate. So if I click on that, that's going to show me what the render is going to look like. And we can see the focal length over here. So by default, it's 35. You know, maybe like 50 might be a good focal length. That's a more typical portrait lens in photography. So, you know, you can have this be whatever you want it to be, right? But just remember, like a low number like this will exaggerate perspective. So 15 is kind of like a fisheye. And then 50 to 85 is your typical portrait lens. So you see how the space gets flattened as the number gets bigger, right? So it gets less and less fisheye the more it gets moved up. And so it eventually starts to become telephoto, where space totally flattens out. But again, like 50, 85, something like that. That's, you know, usually what I like to have. And then, so what I need to do is I need to lock this camera. So that's really important. So I just set up the camera. And remember, you can reference back to my video tutorials on rendering. Like we could add depth of field and do a bunch of cool stuff with this. But right here, I just want to lock my camera. And so this is really important. You do not want this camera moving around. So once you get this camera positioned, and you want to just make sure that we can see your whole character. There's maybe a little bit of space at the top, a little bit of space at the bottom. And, you know, once this kind of feels right, then we can just click on this lock button. And so that'll lock the camera. And so now I can't move the camera by mistake anymore. So from here, you know, you can always, you know, this might be a good time to save your work, right? So I'll just call this always be saving, right? And yeah, and just before you set off, you know, just check the Arnold render view and just, you know, see, does this look right? You know, again, I would want to light this a little bit more, but again, I'm mainly focusing on setup and animation. So, all right, so let's talk about how to animate the turntable aspect of this. And before I do that, you know, with the base right here, you know, typically I would like to go in, select that edge, and, you know, just give the base a little bit more love. You typically, especially in like a realistic render, just keep presentation in mind, right? So this hard edge doesn't look awesome, right? So you can just double right click, go to edge mode, double click the edge, bevel that, and add segments into that, and just kind of round it out a little bit. And, you know, I can always change the size of it as well. Just kind of depends on what you want this to look like. And, you know, little things like that add up. Bevels are really important on inorganic objects because when the light hits, there's really no such thing as an object in real life that doesn't have some sort of bevel on it, right? And so you see how there's like that white highlight that happens. And so it's just that little bit goes a really long way. So, all right, so now ready to talk about animation. So under workspace, I will change the workspace over to animation. And so that just gives me a timeline down here. And so this is going to be a really basic animation tutorial. And so I have the playhead, this yellow thing right here. It shows me what frame I'm on. You can see it corresponds down there as well. And so this is going to be a really simple, easy animation. So you can see I have the playhead at 0. And you can have your animation be 48 frames for 2 seconds. I kind of prefer 72 for a turnaround. That's just a little bit better timing. So it's essentially a 3-second turnaround, which I think is enough time where the character can kind of turn around in 360 degrees and we can kind of show them off nicely. You could even go slower than 72. You know, so you could take it up to 4 seconds. So your timing is up to you. So I'm going to recommend 72, but you can make it a more or or less if you're okay with the turn being pretty rapid. So right here, remember I centered the pivot before as my first step, and so that's really important to have that centered pivot. So when I rotate this character, it'll rotate from the center. And so I just move the playhead to 0. And one thing I can do, and I have my character head selected right here, is I can go to modify and then freeze transformations. I think that'll be a helpful thing to do. So look over here at the transformations. You can see there's some numbers going on right there. So if I click on freeze transformations, it just zeroes everything out. And so that can be really helpful for this animation step. And so all I need to do is, which aspect am I rotating? We're only rotating Y. So I could select my model and press S, and that sets keyframes for everything. But what I would recommend doing is just click on Y, right click, and then key selected. And so that creates a keyframe on the 0 frame at 0. And then I'm just going to move this up to 72. And from here, I'll just rotate this. So if I rotate it 180 degrees, that'll bring it so the character's facing away from us. But we need them to do a full 360. So I'll type in 360 right here. And then I'll just right click and key select it again. And you can see a little green thing shows up right there. So if I just zoom out a little bit, I can also drag and select like this and press F, and that'll frame up my keyframes. And so right now, if I were to animate this, it's doing a 360, but it's kind of, I don't know if you can see this graph. This helps if you've taken animation before, but it's easing in to that view and easing out of that view, which, might be good, but I would want this to be able to loop at a consistent rate. And so what I recommend doing is just selecting both of these keyframes like this, and we're going to set this so that there's no ease in or ease out. So we can see all these different graph buttons, and I'm obviously not going to go over all this today, but if you click on this button, so linear tangent, so it should just be like a little diagonal right there. So look for linear tangents. Remember you can hold your cursor over things to kind of see what they mean. So I can click on linear tangents, and you see that gets rid of that graph, and so now it's just a straight line from 0 to 72. And from here, I can see my range of frames at this bar down here. And so I'll just set this from 0 to 72. And so now our timeline is restricted to that 360. And so now we have our animation. So I'm just going to press File Save to save that. I recommend testing your animation. So a good way to do that is I can right click on the timeline and go to Playblast. And I'll go to Playblast settings just to see if there's any settings that I should be changing here. And so from the display size, this is from the window right now, and so you can see how my animation timeline is kind of squishing this, so my resolution gate's not actually showing me the full render. So I'm going to try this where I'm just going to try to render this from render settings and photo JPEG. All this is good. And so what a Playblast is it's just basically a test render where it renders out in real time what you can kind of see on your screen. And so we'll see that in just a moment. So I'll press apply and it'll render that out. And from here, I'll go to view and then loop and press play. And so you can see I have a turnaround. And so from here, we can take this into After Effects and loop the animation from there. So we'll essentially render this as a PNG sequence or a JPEG sequence. And you can open it up from there into After Effects or Premiere and play it back at that point.